Welcome to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist depression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift podcast. Andy here. I don't usually add much into the radio shows that I edit down to these podcasts, but I thought I'd just mention a bit of context here. Today's show is about the Australian Coalition Opposition Party's plan to build nuclear reactors, and the show was first made back on the 21st of June, in the week that the announcement had been made. There was a lot of talk about it at the time, and I didn't publish this one as a podcast then, but it hasn't gone away, and particularly in the last week there's been a bit of news coverage about it again, and I think we're going to need to oppose this nuclear reactor madness if we want it to not happen, because Peter Dutton and his coalition parties are very serious about it for various reasons, and so I've dug this episode back out to upload as a podcast. Hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you out there trying to make a better world. Today on the show, we are going to be talking about Peter Dutton's proposed plan for nuclear reactors. You probably heard about it. It's certainly been in the news this week. And just in case anybody hasn't heard about it, I thought today on the Paradigm Shift we'd delve a little bit into it and try to talk about some reasons to oppose it. I'll go straight out there. I'm not in favour of a plan of building nuclear reactors, nor are many people, it seems, actually, from the media coverage and the kind of experts who have been referred to in the media coverage this week. There are a lot of reasons to oppose it. I'll give you a little bit of an intro now. We will later on talk with Jim Green from Friends of the Earth about a bit of more analysis of it, and we'll hear from Ben Pennings, who, as part of Queensland Conservation Council, is organising a little rally on Monday at the LNP headquarters here in Brisbane to remind them that the community generally oppose nuclear power in this country, and historically have, as we'll hear. But let's talk a bit about the plan. So if you missed it, Peter Dutton says he has 7 sites where they would build nuclear power. 2 of them would be what's called small modular reactors, which is a different technology to the traditional reactors. It's actually pretty untested. In Europe, there have been attempts to build small modular reactors, but a lot of them have been abandoned, and so there's actually not many functioning, only 1 or 2, I think, functioning in the world. But Peter Dutton, he's keen to go out as a pioneer, and they would be the ones in South Australia at Port Augusta and Western Australia at Collie. So all the sites would be on the sites of existing coal-fired power stations, which are all due to fade out at some point in the next 15 years, and so Dutton's plan would be to build nuclear power plants on all of them, as well as Port Augusta and Collie. One would be Loy Yang in Gippsland in Victoria, Mount Piper at Lithgow in New South Wales, Liddell in the Hunter Valley, and in Queensland there would be one at Tarong, which is sort of near Nanango or Kingaroy out that way, and another one at Catalide, which is near Billawilla, sort of near Rockhampton. So that's the proposed sites. And beyond that, we didn't get much info, actually. It was a very short media briefing about all of this, which some people traditionally, in any political announcement, there's quite a bit of detail, and you would expect for something as significant as building Australia's first nuclear power plants and something as tricky as nuclear energy, which of course there's lots of details about safe storage of waste, risk management of the reactors themselves, and of course the cost, the immense cost that they would have. There wasn't too much detail. In fact, when it came to costs, there was none. No mention of how much it would cost. Possibly because they didn't want people to see how big the number is. In the past, the Australian science body CSIRO has done a study. It was only this year, actually, they released it, and they said that nuclear power would cost 50% more than generating the same amount of power from renewable energy. So we're talking a lot of money. And, of course, it would take away from the investment that goes into renewable energy, which potentially gets cheaper as technologies get better and money keeps being invested, but it will be drawing money out of that sphere. And politically, Dutton's play, it seems risky, because he's bargaining on there being a lot of public support for nuclear power, which some have suggested there is, although traditionally there hasn't been in Australia. When there have been people in the past talking about building nuclear power, it's consistently been opposed. But there seems, from their polling, it seems there's some support, but there's certainly going to be issues with, one, the communities where the nuclear power plants are set to be built, who most likely will oppose having that in their backyard. There's also the matter of bans. Some of the state governments and the federal government, in fact, have a kind of moratorium on nuclear energy, and so that would have to be lifted somehow. And here in Queensland, even the Liberal opposition leader, David Crisafulli, has said that if his party were elected at the end of this year, then they would still be opposed to nuclear power. Of course, it's not unheard of for politicians to lie or to say something and then go back on it later. But that's an indication of where people sense that the public mood is on these kind of things. And so Peter Dutton taking a big risk, but he might be onto something, because outside of the sort of media class, there is a kind of large-scale opposition to renewable energy once you get out into country areas. The propaganda has been very effective at kind of talking about how bad renewable energy is, and a lot of rural communities are against large-scale renewable energy projects being built near them, and so Dutton might seek a chance to seize on this, although, of course, the scale of nuclear power is another thing, another step up from renewable energy. But also, there's a lot of big corporations who are quite invested in the nuclear industry, and so to the Liberal Party power base of big corporations and the National Party power base of mining companies, there might be some support for it, and it might be able to draw on some of that wealth and power when it comes to the election. So maybe he knows something we don't, although he's been criticised a lot. My own personal view is that we should be very wary of building anything to do with the nuclear industry. For one, because the threat of nuclear war always looms above us, and the more uranium we're digging out of the ground, but the more plutonium we're generating, the more possibility there is for it to be used on us one day, and it would be catastrophic in many ways. And there are risks. I mean, at this stage there's been nuclear power for 60 years or so, and there haven't been that many accidents with nuclear power plants around the world, but when they are very, very bad, and it's worth remembering that, the chance of something going terribly wrong. And I think as well there's really existential questions about what do we want our legacy to be as individuals and as a society at this point in history for into the future. Do we want to leave toxic nuclear waste for the next 100,000 years, and whatever civilizations to come are going to have to deal with our legacy because we wanted cheap power? We generated this thing for the next 100,000 years for them to fear and learn about again and again the dangers of it. Or, do we want to be building something that future generations will be grateful for our legacy? That's the kind of question that we should ask when it comes to nuclear energy. And, of course, the other question is about Aboriginal people, as we'll hear from Jim Green. So often in the history of this country, the opposition to the nuclear industry and, in fact, the main costs, whether it's nuclear weapons testing on Aboriginal country or uranium mining on Aboriginal country or the proposed nuclear waste dumps on Aboriginal country, the costs have always been pushed onto the original people of this land, and the resistance has often been led by Aboriginal people. And so for reasons of supporting the rights of people who've been in this land for a long time and who had it before it was taken off them by European settlement, we should oppose them in solidarity with Aboriginal people. And we are now going to hear from Jim Green, who is spokesperson for the Friends of the Earth Anti-Nuclear Collective.
Jim Green, and I'm the National Nuclear Campaigner with Friends of the Earth.
And it's been a busy week for nuclear campaigners, with Peter Dutton's announcement this week of the Liberal Party's plan for nuclear reactors. I guess we'll take it as a given that you don't think it's a very good plan. Do you want to tell us why you think we should oppose Peter Dutton's plan for nuclear reactors?
Well, because it's part of a broader plan to derail the transition to renewable energy. So it's not just a plan to build nuclear reactors, it's also a plan to stop the rollout of large-scale renewables and part of a plan to ditch Australia's short and medium-term greenhouse emissions targets and to abandon the current government's target of 82% renewables by 2030. So it needs to be seen in that context. It's not a serious plan about reducing greenhouse emissions. On the contrary, it's a plan to expand and prolong the use of coal and gas. So we can't be fooled by the rhetoric, and we can't be fooled by the simple truism that nuclear power is low carbon, because, as I say, this is part of a broader plan to increase greenhouse emissions. And to do the bidding of the fossil fuel industries and the fossil fuel donors to the coalition parties. So that's one set of reasons. I won't go into detail about the others, but nuclear power is far more expensive than renewables, even when you include the cost of transmission and energy storage. And of course, there are all the risks and problems that you and your listeners will be aware of, with high-level nuclear waste and the risk of catastrophic accidents and the patterns of successive governments trying to dump nuclear waste on Aboriginal communities despite their opposition. So whichever way you look at it, this just doesn't have any credibility whatsoever.
It seems from the media response this week, a lot of analysts agree that they're very critical of the plan and see it as politically very risky. But does Peter Dutton know something that they don't? I mean, looking at the politics behind the announcement, are there things going on that maybe a lot of the commentariat are missing?
Well, I don't think so. We could all be proven wrong, but you know, it's certainly bad policy, but I don't think the politics works out at all. I think a better explanation is that he's as thick as a brick, and the Shadow Energy Minister, Ted O'Brien, is as thick as a brick. And they get excited about things like a reasonably high level of support. When you ask Australians if they support nuclear power, you might get a figure of around 60% when you ask that general question. But if you ask people if they would be comfortable with a nuclear power reactor being built in their local area, well, people are hostile, and that's come through very clearly in every opinion poll over the past 20 years. So that's where they fall down. They're just looking at these general abstract opinion polls and getting way too excited about them. And politically, this is poison, not just for these regions where people don't want to live near nuclear power reactors, but across the whole country. He's put all the state Liberal parties in a really difficult position, and the Liberal parties in the states that are being targeted are mostly openly opposed to Dutton's nuclear plans, or at best they're neutral. All the Teal seats are going to remain Teal seats. The Greens will hold their seats and possibly pick up more seats. So across the whole country, I think this is an absolute stink bomb. And it's worth remembering that John Howard went down this path and it didn't work well for him at all. He went to the 2007 election promoting nuclear power. He lost his seat. The coalition lost government. And the nuclear power policy was ditched within a week of the loss of the 2007 election.
Yeah, I'm interested in talking a bit more about that history that some people might not know of opposition. But before we do, I guess the other big announcement in recent years about nuclear energy has been about AUKUS and Australia, having nuclear-powered submarines. I guess how much should we see this as part of a broader policy of trying to expand Australia's nuclear operations in general, in other ways, including potentially, having radioactive waste dumps that accept waste and other things? Do you think that there is a broader plan?
Well, it's impossible to know, but I think it's really important to think about it and to speculate about it. And I say it's impossible to know because Dutton is certainly not going to confess to whatever hidden agendas he may have. That could be AUKUS related. It could even be opening up the option of Australia developing nuclear weapons. Could be opening up that idea of Australia becoming the world's nuclear waste dump. All those things are possible, but we can only speculate. In terms of AUKUS, the coalition argues that we're jeopardising Australia's national security by maintaining this ban against nuclear power, and we need a civil nuclear power industry to underpin and to support AUKUS. The problem with that, firstly, it's not true. Secondly, when the Morrison government announced AUKUS, they were very clear that Australia does not need and will not pursue a civil nuclear power industry to AUKUS. And that's also the position of the current Labor government.
So you mentioned before a bit about a history of opposition by the Australian public, and it goes back a long, long way. Of course, in a lot of ways it would make a lot of sense for Australia as one of the world's biggest uranium miners to have nuclear power, but it hasn't been the case, and Australian people have consistently pushed back against attempts at creating nuclear power. Do you want to tell us a bit about that history?
Yeah, well, it only makes sense for Australia to take back the waste arising from uranium exports at a very superficial level, but if you drill a bit deeper, what that could mean is uranium being dug up from Aboriginal country despite the opposition of First Nations peoples, and then having the high-level waste being dumped on Aboriginal communities despite their opposition. So you get a double whammy of radioactive racism, which doesn't make much sense at all. But in terms of nuclear power, I guess the shortest history I can give you is that there's only been one serious pursuit of nuclear power in Australia. That was in the late 60s under Prime Minister John Gorton. He was looking for a nuclear reactor at Jervis Bay, which is Commonwealth land on the New South Wales coast. And the fascinating thing about that is that he openly acknowledged that there was a hidden weapons agenda behind that push for nuclear power, because nuclear reactors produce plutonium. Anyway, that was defeated because of widespread opposition, and because when John Gorton was replaced by Billy McMahon, McMahon didn't want to spend the money and probably wasn't as fixated on the idea of opening up a weapons capability as John Gorton was. So that was defeated. Since then, there hasn't really been any serious push at all. But there have been constant pushes to dump nuclear waste on Aboriginal land. And amazingly, they've all been defeated. It's always a David and Goliath struggle, with community campaigns led by Aboriginal traditional owners on the one side and the federal government with all of its resources on the other hand. But those proposals have all been knocked on the head. Firstly, under the Howard government, a plan for a dump in Woomera in South Australia was defeated. Then Muckaty in the Northern Territory, Flinders Ranges in South Australia, and most recently Kimber in South Australia, where the Bungalow traditional owners prevailed. And also a plan to make South Australia the world's nuclear waste dump. That was defeated in 2016. So it's been a real struggle. It's taken up a lot of energy from a lot of people, but we have defeated all of these nuclear waste proposals so far.
Yeah, and on a smaller scale, there's things like the nuclear-free councils, and even Jay Weatherall, as South Australian Premier, did put quite a bit of effort into consulting with South Australian people about the possibility of building a nuclear reactor, and it ultimately came out saying that the public was against it then as well, hey?
Well, actually, for Weatherall, he wasn't so interested in a nuclear reactor. He set up a Royal Commission which said that nuclear reactors would be uneconomic, but the Royal Commission said South Australia could get filthy rich by becoming the world's high-level nuclear waste dump. And Weatherall supported that, but he also had this idea about participatory democracy. So he set up something called a citizens' jury, and they really stacked it. They pressured this citizens' jury to either support the proposed nuclear waste import proposal, or to at least give it an amber light and, conditional approval. But the citizens' jury, which comprised about 300 people, they said a flat no. They weren't persuaded by the economic evidence. Most importantly of all, they heard clearly and loudly from Aboriginal traditional owners that they didn't want this to happen. So that was probably their number one argument, was solidarity with Aboriginal people. So Weatherall kind of got himself in a bind. He'd set up this citizens' jury. The citizens' jury said no. And then the Liberal opposition in South Australia, they thought they would oppose it and gain some political advantage by doing that. So the whole thing collapsed, thankfully.
Yes, well, hopefully this one will as well, I suppose. But for those of us who think it's a bad idea to build nuclear reactors and who want to defend, I guess, renewable energy as a solution to climate crisis, what do you think we need to do to oppose this policy?
Well, anything and everything. A starting point would be people get online and look up Don't Nuke the Climate. There's a Australian Don't Nuke the Climate initiative and also an international one. So that's a good place for information. Also the Friends of the Earth website, nuclear.foe.org.au. And that Friends of the Earth website has a contacts page where people can find their closest active anti-nuclear group, or people can set up their own groups. When John Howard was promoting nuclear power, the number of active anti-nuclear groups in Australia doubled in a short space of time, so people can do that. Beyond that, whatever people can do, writing to newspapers, writing to politicians, ringing up talkback radio, being keyboard warriors, signing petitions, every little bit helps.
All right, thanks very much, Jim.
Yeah, no worries at all, Andy. Thank you.
You are listening to 4ZZZ Paradigm Shift. We just heard from Jim Green from Friends of the Earth, their nuclear spokesperson, and on the line right now I have Ben Pennings from Queensland Conservation Council. How are you doing, Ben?
I'm good. How are you, Andy?
Very good. Nice to have you back on the air at 4ZZZ. So we have heard from Jim Green, I guess, taking apart some of the things in this policy. But one of the reasons I thought I would get you on the line is that you are helping to organise a protest out the front of the LNP headquarters in Albion on Monday morning. What's the reason for getting out there on the streets?
Well, it's really to send a message to the LNP as a party. So, yeah, there is some conservation groups involved, but there's also the Electrical Trades Union, and I think the Mining and Energy Union may be joining us as well. So it's, unionists and conservationists joining together to send the message to the LNP headquarters. We could go to Dutton's office, which many of us have done before, but he's sold on it. But the LNP are all over the place. the state LNP saying they don't want it, the federal LNP saying they do want nuclear, and it's the same party. So there is a state election coming up, so we actually want to go to the headquarters of the LNP 10:30 on Monday to really ask those key questions. But also it's on Sandgate Road, a nice little busy area there, and we actually want to show people, driving by or on buses going by, that there's, the protests against this, ridiculous distraction from the real issues is on the way, and we need to protest it.
It's interesting, a lot of the media has taken it, ridiculous is actually the kind of word that's being used in mainstream channels. But I guess a lot of things are ridiculous about our current energy policy, and yet they still kind of go on. Do you think that there's a risk that we could be a bit complacent and that actually we need to be out there on the streets and campaigning against this?
Oh, we do, and we need to include coal and gas as part of that as well, is that there is a transition to better forms of energy. There's a transition to better forms of making steel, but it's too slow, and there is coal and gas projects being approved all the time by state and federal governments, and we need to really look at that bigger picture of what does our energy future look like, and if we are having a transition, what does that look like as well, and what's the best and quickest way to do that, and the most responsible way to do that, and diverting funds investment away from renewables that are not perfect all the time, but are much better than coal and gas. And having a pipe dream of nuclear in 15 years down the track when coal-fired power plants would have died, and even need new coal-fired power plants. It's a real concern, and part of it is a diversion away from the real issues, which is moving away from coal and gas rather than relying on it for a longer period of time.
You mentioned that you've got the unions on board for this, and I guess it's been a bit of a struggle in some ways for the climate movement in this country to kind of win over the unions and the workers' argument. But in this case, the unions have often been against nuclear energy. What's the importance of building a movement across the board with groups like trade unions?
Oh, it's extremely important, and it is a worker safety issue, not only worker safety on site, but workers in all sorts of industries are ultimately individuals and citizens who have the same climate as everyone else, and they have as just much concern for themselves and their kids with regards to what sort of future we're growing up with. So they've got the double whammy of needing to care about where the next meal's coming from, and if there is a transition away from some mining roles, of that being done well, rather than fear and anxiety on both fronts.
All right. Thanks very much, Ben.
Thanks, Andy. Enjoy the day.
Cheers. That is Ben Pennings there talking about the rally he's organising at the LNP headquarters. And as ever, we will need people power. How we can build a movement that can put forward real answers to our climate crisis, and answers that come from people working together in their communities rather than a few politicians and their corporate lobbyists coming up with schemes of how they can prolong the projects that make the most money for themselves and their donors. And so ultimately, when it comes down to it, the Peter Dutton's proposal of nuclear reactors, it is crazy, but the only way that we can stop it and get a climate policy that will work out the best for everyone, is going to be hard work of local communities working together and coming up with solutions and coming up with power to challenge the big corporations, the big mining corporations, and the power they hold politically. And so it's going to take some thinking, some strategy, and some action. I'll see you next week.